Welcome to Region 4's Maintaining Mental and Behavioral Wellness Virtually sessions. My name is Vicki Babs, and I'm an educational specialist in the Special Education Solutions Department on the Behavior and PBIS teams. This session is Maximizing Structure in a Virtual Learning Environment. What we're going to talk about during this session is we're going to review quickly the 5 evidence-based practices of class-wide positive behavior intervention and support. We're going to discuss and dive a little deeper into the first evidence-based practice of maximize structure. We're going to chat about some examples and what it looks like in a classroom, face-to-face learning environment to maximize structure, and then problem solve and review what we can do in a virtual learning environment to maximize structure. So when you signed on to this recording today on the website, you should also see an option to download some handouts or note-taking guide. That information is what I'm going to be reviewing, and you may want to take a moment to download those handouts so that you can follow along and maybe have somewhere to take notes. Also, when I ask questions or pose a question to you during this session, feel free to pause the recording, jot down your answer or think about your answer, and then pick back up when you're ready to continue on. All right, before we get started, I want to review a few considerations for virtual teaching and online learning. First off is be patient and understanding to others as well as yourself. This is a unique time, and it's really important to remember that it takes time to adapt to any new situation. So please make sure you're patient and understanding. Again, not only to others, but also to yourself. Please be mindful of varied access to technology, materials, and resources that your students might have. It would be important for you to work with your administrators to develop plans on how you're going to address this possible lack of resources, whether that be technology or whether it be materials and resources, and how you can make sure that students have equitable access to all instruction. In addition, please be sensitive to the fact that not all students will be comfortable showing their homes or their rooms or even themselves during online learning. So you may want to consider options such as allowing students to leave their cameras turned off. Please be sensitive to those feelings of your students. Another important consideration is that at this time, during this unique learning situation, communication with everyone is key. Open communication between school and home and with families and students is so important. So anything you can do to facilitate that is recommended. And then lastly, please make sure to follow any guidelines or directives that your district and campus leadership has outlined regarding virtual and distance learning. All right, so in a previously recorded session, we have an overview of the 5 evidence-based practices of class-wide PBIS. This session, we're going to review the first evidence-based practice of maximize structure. The other evidence-based practices include establish and teach expectations, increase academic engagement, develop a continuum of responses to encourage appropriate behavior, and develop a continuum of responses to discourage inappropriate behavior. Also, at the center of all of these evidence-based practices is the concept of data, remembering to identify the data you're going to use, review that data, and let it guide you in terms of when you might need to adapt and make some changes to your implementation of the evidence-based practices. And then in terms of relationships, I want to point out that underlying all of those evidence-based practices is the core and foundational concept of strong relationships between you and your students. These relationships are so vital during face-to-face instruction, and they are as equally important, if not more important, during this time of virtual and distance learning. So please remember to focus as well. As much time that you focus on academics and instruction, please also focus on the use of strategies that will continue to enhance, develop, and maintain your relationships with your students. There are sessions in this series that have been recorded that will review various strategies in relationship building. So please feel free to access those when you get a chance. So in the area of maximize structure, there's 3 key components we're going to talk about today. The first one is consider the physical arrangement. That includes decor, decorations, desk positions, assigned seats, traffic flow. Also, the second component is organization, and the third is predictable routines. So before we get started, I want you to start thinking and take a moment to think about when you're in your classroom instructing your students, how is it that you want your students to feel about your classroom and learning environment? So words like organized, safe, happy, comfortable, welcome, cheerful, those might have been some of the feelings that you want your classroom to convey to your students. So I want to ask you to think, are these the same feelings you would like your students to have during virtual learning? And when we talk about virtual learning during this session, we're referring to asynchronous learning, where the students, you will provide information and directives for the students and they will work at their own pace. And we're also talking about synchronous learning, where you might be on a computer in a program or on a platform live instructing your students. And so as you design your virtual learning lesson plans and you begin to teach your students virtually, please remember to keep in mind those qualities and feelings that you want your lessons and your instruction to convey, and think about how you can best make those happen. So the first component of maximizing structure is physical arrangement. This can include the concepts of decor, desk arrangement, floor plans, but then you also want to think of things in a classroom like, can the teacher see all the students? Can the students see the teacher or the source of instruction? Are there pathways that are safe for transitions and for the flow of traffic in the classroom? Can the students access actively and frequently used materials? Are the potential distractions in a classroom taken into account and addressed based on the physical arrangement of the room? So those are all questions we ask ourselves when we're setting up physical arrangement in a face-to-face classroom learning environment. So in a virtual learning environment, we won't be able to address these issues like we would in a classroom, but there are still some of these areas that we want to take into consideration. So while you may not be able to make sure students have access to certain materials and resources or have them kept in a specific place, what you can do is use some time setting up some lessons for your students in which you review what might be beneficial for them to have set up in their own individual learning environment. This is another area where you please be sensitive to the limitations. Not all students will have the same access to materials and resources, as well as their settings may not be the same. So not every student will have a room of their own or an office area in which to work. So any guidance you can provide for them in terms of what resources to have at hand prior to the beginning of a lesson and what materials to have access to, those are going to be the ways that you can help them virtually set up their physical arrangement. You may also want to have lessons and discussions with your students about possible and potential distractions within their learning environment now, and then problem solve and discuss ways that they can address those. Another component of physical environment and looking at maximizing structure is considering the classroom decor. So in a classroom, when you're face-to-face with your students, I want you to think about what you've typically got up on the walls. You might have had ideas such as anchor charts pop up into your mind, your rules and expectations charts, maybe classroom and school news, assignments, homework assignments, learning objectives. Student work might be displayed, a calendar. So there's lots of different things that you have up and about in your room. So when you think about those items, think of those items that for you are necessary or that you really prefer to have access to when you are teaching. So while you're not in your classroom right now, think about ways that you can develop or provide those same supports virtually that are visual for your students in a virtual learning setting. So for example, when you are thinking about anchor charts and agendas or schedules or rules and expectations posters, you may want to develop these on a PDF document and email them to your students. You could also write your own handwritten versions or print out these same documents, and then you can hold them up and show them during your instruction or during the video. You might want to consider conducting a quick and short lesson with the students on creating their own smaller versions of academic anchor charts or expectations posters or agendas. And that way they get practice doing this, plus then they have their own version that they can keep on hand. So it's important when you've developed, depending on whichever of these options you use or something different that we haven't even mentioned, whichever option you use, it's important that you review these at the beginning of each lesson or activity with the students, and that you teach them and instruct them how to use those and when they are used. Now, moving on to the concept of organization, it's important to be organized. With organization, we jokingly say, the more the better. And it's true. A really important component is a large part of staying organized is establishing and maintaining predictable routines in your classroom. And this is going to be important too in our virtual learning sessions. So when it comes to organization in a virtual world, it's important for you to model for your students what good organization looks like. You might be able to show them, these are the materials that you want ready for a lesson, and you want them in this specific order. And then you can turn your camera and show the students how you have your materials and resources organized. And this is an area where you can teach the students what they can have available or should have available during various synchronous or asynchronous lessons. Predictable routines are another way to remain organized and help students be organized during not just face-to-face classroom environments, but also in virtual learning environments. So routines are those, routines are defined as regular course of procedure or a habitual or mechanical performance of a procedure. And so when you think of routines, you probably think of the fact that you have very specific routines in your face-to-face classroom environment. And it's important to note that you'll still have routines in virtual learning lessons, again, whether those are asynchronous or synchronous, and they're going to look different. But while they're different, they're still as equally important to the routines that you have in your face-to-face classrooms. So when you're thinking of those routines, please consider as you're planning and lesson planning for live or asynchronous lessons, think of all the different routines, the different steps that your students need to engage in prior to logging on, once they're logged on, and outline all of those routines and then review those and teach your students those routines to help their virtual learning lessons be successful. And then when it comes to routines, how do we ensure that our students follow routines? Well, we've got 5 steps in making sure that our students follow the routines. And the first is we must define each routine ahead of time. Next, we must teach each of these routines. Third, you must prompt students to follow the routines. Fourth is you must reinforce the students when they follow the routines and engage in those behaviors that that match up with those routines. And then lastly, evaluate the effectiveness of the routines. And then depending on how they're going and how the students are performing, you may need to adjust as necessary. So this list, as was noted before, is in the note-taking guide, as with all the information that we've reviewed, and it's accessible online. So quick summary is the first evidence-based practice is maximizing structure. And while you plan your virtual lessons, please consider how you will have students set up their physical arrangement or their physical environment, how they should organize, and then how you should develop and teach routines to the students to help them be successful in virtual learning environments. So thank you for joining the Maximizing Structure in a Virtual Learning Environment session as a part of Region 4's Maintaining Mental and Behavioral Wellness Virtually series. We hope that you've obtained some practical tools to take and use immediately. Please feel free to review and take advantage of the other great resources available on the webpage. We hope you can join us for upcoming sessions updated weekly. Thank you and have a great day.